Welcome to all of you who have come together at this most alarming moment in history. I'm Nina Tumarkin. I'm Catherine Wasserman Davis, professor of Slavic Studies here at Wellesley and director of the college's Russian Area Studies program, and most importantly, professor of history, my home department, which joins Russian Area Studies as sponsor of this important panel. I mentioned Catherine Davis, Wellesley class of 28, a splendid person and I would say personnage, and the college's generous benefactor and benefactor of Harvard as well. She died in 2013 at the age of 106. The year after graduating from Wellesley, she journeyed on horseback in the Caucasus Mountains, and after that she was hooked. For decades, Catherine was devoted to the study of the USSR, made dozens of visits to that country, and sometimes in the company of the late Wellesley College economics professor, Marshall Goldman. Both Catherine and Marshall would have been beyond heartbroken at this catastrophic war in Ukraine. A few days ago, our Wellesley College president, Dr. Paula Johnson, sent out to our community a statement of solidarity with the people of Ukraine, some of which I'd like to quote. Paula wrote, "I have watched with great alarm as Russia continues its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, escalating a conflict that has caused untold suffering, displaced millions of Ukrainians, and destabilized the international community. My thoughts are with the people of Ukraine who are displaying countless acts of courage as they stand up to this aggression, and with the many Russian citizens who have come out in cities across Russia to protest this unjust war at great personal risk. Wellesley College is devoted to freedom, human rights, and democratic values and ideals, and we will do all we can to support every member of our community whose families, friends, and loved ones are affected by this tragedy. Thank you, Paula." I am old enough to remember the Vietnam War and the protests it inspired. "The whole world is watching" was a phrase chanted by anti-Vietnam War demonstrators. Well, pretty much the whole world is watching now in breathless agitation as we've seen the military buildup on Ukraine's borders, and a major crisis turned into a conflict and then into outright war in a matter of days. From President Putin's February 21st recognition of the so-called independence of Ukraine's separatist provinces of Donetsk and Luhansk, which have been at war with the Ukrainian government for 8 years, then to a full-scale military invasion launched on the 24th. You have all seen the horrific events unfold in these past 2 weeks, bombing, shelling, the destruction of Ukrainian cities, unheard of since the Second World War and reminiscent even of the Mongol invasions of the 13th century. In response, over 2 million Ukrainians in flight, a robust pushback from Ukrainian military forces, unprecedented unity of the Western alliance. The history of Russia and the former Soviet space has long been played in a minor key, but all this leaves us positively breathless. I'm grateful that 2 distinguished speakers from Harvard and Stanford accepted my invitation to share their insights on these consequential and alarming events. Each of our speakers will make a presentation to be followed by some dialogue between the 2 of them, and then I'll open the floor to questions from the audience, which you can put into the Q&A little icon of your screen. Our first speaker, Dr. Alexandra Vakru, will come at the topic from the Russian perspective, and Professor Norman Neymark will focus primarily on Ukraine. Let me note, and this is partly in honor of a conversation I had with Alexandra in advance, that today is International Women's Day, long celebrated in the USSR and Russia, a holiday that Alexandra Vakru and I have long found particularly abhorrent, because of its demeaning attitude towards women. Some of you might know that on February 25th, the day after the invasion, the Kremlin website was hacked and unavailable both here and in Russia. But it was back up yesterday after all this time down, in time for Putin to post his congratulations to women of the Russian Federation. Just a couple of lines for your delectation. quote, "We live in difficult times, global economic challenges and problems, military conflicts, and the inevitable need to protect our people and our country, a pandemic and the struggle for the life and health of millions of citizens. But even during the most difficult trials of the Great Patriotic War, nothing could prevent the men of Russia from confessing their love to their women. And this love served as a support and an inspiration. Our dear women, you make the world better, kinder, thanks to sensitivity, compassion, and spiritual generosity. You combine charming tenderness and amazing inner strength. I would like to address the mothers, wives, sisters, brides, and girlfriends of our soldiers and officers who are now in battle defending Russia during a special military operation. I understand how you worry about your loved ones. You can be proud of them. Let me emphasize that the soldiers who are doing military service do not and will not participate in any military hostilities. As you know, Russia's actions, now is Nina talking, in Ukraine are not allowed to be referred to as invasion or war, and you can get up to 15 years in prison for doing so in the media. Enough of Putin and women. I'm now going to introduce Alexandra Vakru. Alexandra Vakru is executive director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Her scholarly work addresses many Russian and Eurasian policy issues. In addition, she teaches courses on the comparative politics of Eurasia and post-Soviet conflict and has mentored dozens of Harvard's best and brightest Russian regional studies students and scholars. Prior to joining the Davis Center in 2010, Alexandra held a variety of scholarly and business positions in the US and Russia. She was a scholar at the Kennan Institute in Washington, DC, and worked for the Social Science Research Council. And while living in Moscow for more than a decade in the 1990s, she was consultant to the Russian privatization agency, a partner at the Brunswick Warburg Investment Bank, and member of the board of United Way Moscow. Alexandra Vakru, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nina. Did you want to introduce Norman also, or do you want me to start?
I did want to introduce Norman.
Okay.
Thank you.
No problem.
Dear woman, you understand. So now I'm introducing Norman Neymark. Norman Neymark is Robert and Florence McDonald Professor of East European Studies at Stanford and Senior Fellow, by courtesy, of the Freeman Spogli Institute and the Hoover Institution. He received all of his degrees at Stanford and taught at Boston University and was a fellow at the Russian Research Center at Harvard before returning to Stanford as a faculty member in 1988. His recent books include Fires of Hatred, Ethnic Cleansing in 20th Century Europe, Stalin's Genocide, and also Genocide, a World History, that came out in 2017. And there are many other books, including most famously The Russians in Germany, a study of the Soviet post-war occupation. Most recent is this book, Stalin and the Fate of Europe, Stalin and the Fate of Europe. And so Norman knows a great deal about what happens when the Russian bear moves west. He is also past president of the Association for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies and recipient of its distinguished contributions to Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, an award which honors senior scholars who have helped build and develop the field through scholarship, teaching, and service to the profession. And most importantly, in the mid-80s, I think it was in 87 to 88, Norman taught at Wellesley for an entire year, fleeing John Silber at BU, and very happy at Wellesley he was. So you will be hearing from him later, and the floor now goes to Alexandra. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Nina. That gave me a little time to get over Putin's words, so I needed those extra few minutes. Nina's asked me to cover a lot of ground in about 12 minutes. I think I'm supposed to cover the entire Russian landscape and as well as Putin's inner mind. So it's going to be a rather whirlwind tour of some of the key issues. but I'm sure that I'll be raising as many questions as I answer, and I hope that we can get to a lot of them in the Q&A at the end. So let me get started, but first I want to be very clear that this is a war of choice. Vladimir Putin, possibly with a very small group of people, decided that he was going to invade Ukraine. He didn't have to. Many advised him not to, but he did. So nothing that I'm going to be talking about now relating to Putin is meant to minimize or somehow underestimate the importance of the Ukrainians in this war and what they've been subjected to. But my task is to focus on Russia. So that's what I'm going to do. I think it's really important that we understand what Putin is thinking. And so I have a short presentation here. I couldn't resist. And I want to try and just get a better understanding of what Putin wants and why he's decided to invade Ukraine. So he wants a couple things, right? He, like many Soviet and Russian leaders before him, appears to be convinced that Russia is highly vulnerable to being invaded. Now, this is something we often have trouble understanding in the US. We've got those big oceans to the east and west and big friendly neighbors to the north and to the south, but Russia is essentially in the middle of a plain and has indeed been invaded many times. The Swedes, the French, the Mongols, the Turks again, they've been invaded quite a few times. And so over the years, there was this idea that the only way to keep Russia safe is to have a ring of buffer states around it. And so the Russian Empire had some countries around it between itself and Europe. The Soviet Union had the satellite of Soviet socialist republics, 14 of them between themselves and Europe. And then after the Berlin Wall came down in '89 and the Soviet Union collapsed, there was the Russian border, and then there was Eastern Europe, and then there was Western Europe. We're going to talk about all of that, and I'll show you a map. But that is the first question, is how to keep NATO far away from Russia's borders. The second thing that Putin wants is respect as a great power. He would like to see himself, or he does see himself, as equal to China and the United States. Those should be the three countries ruling the world, essentially. And finally, he's keen to secure his legacy. And he intended for this conquest of Ukraine to sort of finish up bringing Russia back from its knees, which is, as the popular expression goes, where Russia had ended up in the 90s and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So let me spend a few minutes on each of these. So in terms of this idea of NATO, if you look at the map on the left, you see in that strange mustardy color, the USSR, and then you see the countries of the Warsaw Pact, Eastern Europe. And the blue line is the border between NATO and Western Europe and the Warsaw Pact, which was the equivalent of NATO for the East, and the USSR. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact dissolves, and many of those countries move towards Europe as fast as they possibly can, many of them joining NATO. And if you look at the map on the right, which I've tipped so that it's in the same place geographically, you can see that the border actually does move about 600 miles closer to Russia. And you can also see that Ukraine is kind of sticking out as a thumb, and that if indeed Ukraine joined NATO, that then the border gets to be very close, right? It goes to be right here. So here's Belarus, which is a friendly country, and then there would be Ukraine. And so the thinking goes in the Kremlin that we can't afford to have Ukraine be part of the Western Bloc, be part of NATO, because then it is right at our border, and that's dangerous for us because we're encircled by enemies and always invaded. As I said, this is the theory. I'm not passing judgment on whether this is accurate or not. The second question is that he wants to be a great power. So what makes a great power great? Well, you could say it's a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. Russia's got that. It's having a sphere of influence. And for Russia, that relates to essentially being able to control those former Soviet socialist republics. So it's the the 5 Central Asian countries in the south, and then it's the, Belarus and Ukraine, ideally to the west. And of course, the Caucasus, you have Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And the way that Russia has controlled these countries is by essentially drawing on the network of people of Putin's age, Putin's generation, who had the same kind of upbringing, who grew up in the Soviet Union, and who are to some extent tied together either through where they went to school, where they worked in the Soviet Union, or some of the oligarchs on which they're dependent for their position. And many of these people are elected, but they're elected with the help of a lot of the pro-Russian oligarchs. And if they behave in ways that aren't consistent with what Moscow thinks is appropriate for them, oftentimes there's a political campaign, an opponent is supported, and the pro-Western or the not enough Russian pro-Russian politician is replaced. And this indirect influence has been quite successful in many of the countries. So in many of the Central Asian countries, I would say at least 3 out of 5 of them, certainly in Azerbaijan and to some extent in Georgia, Russia has been able to control the politicians. A little bit less in Armenia, but Pashinyan was, as the saying goes in Moscow, taught a lesson by the Russians in order to become more favoring Moscow. But Ukraine did not fall into this pattern, right? They did for a while because of the divisions between East and West, which were much more pronounced between 2014. Ukraine was a country that had certain natural cleavages of religion, for example. So the Catholics were in the West and the Orthodox were in the East. In the West, they spoke primarily Ukrainian. In the East, they spoke primarily Russian. And there was enough of a balance that the politicians, every election sort of alternated between being pro-Russian and being pro-Western. After Crimea was annexed in 2014, Russia started to lose its ability to control the political outcomes because they lost quite a lot of voters, not only in Crimea, but also in the separatist areas in the East that they started controlling, which stopped voting. And so as a result, when Zelensky came to power, at first, the Russians thought that he was going to be someone they could work with. He was a native Russian speaker and Jewish, and therefore, potentially open to negotiating with the Russians, which is what he had said. But it looks like the Russians underestimated the extent to which Ukraine had changed since 2014 in a number of ways. And they were not able to control Zelensky indirectly, politically, and therefore thought that if they want to retain their sphere of influence, they're going to have to control him physically by invading. This is the theory, by the way. I'm just giving you the theory. And then the third part of the definition is the ability to project a power abroad. Apparently, Putin was very deeply offended when Obama referred to him and to Russia as a regional power, right? A regional power, yes, some control over what happens in the neighborhood, but not the power to project power abroad. And some speculate that the reason that Russia got so involved in Syria was in fact to show that Russia had the capability of projecting its power beyond its own borders and beyond its own neighborhood to the Middle East. The other thing that's very important to Putin is his legacy. So Vladimir the Great is not Putin, at least that's not what people are referring to him yet. It's this Prince Vladimir who lived about 1,000 years ago and who was the first to unite the principalities of Rus and Novgorod, of what is now Ukraine and Russia. He also was baptized in Crimea, incidentally, and set the region on the path to being a Christian area of the world. This monstrosity, this statue, is 56 feet tall. It's right outside the Kremlin walls. It was actually supposed to be 86 feet tall, but UNESCO objected because it would have dwarfed the Kremlin behind it. And it was consecrated in 2015 by Putin, among others, who praised Vladimir the Great for uniting Russian lands. Incidentally, Vladimir the Great is known as Volodymyr in Ukraine, where he is also seen as instrumental to the history. But I suspect that part of what Putin is thinking is that he restored the Russian economy after the collapse of the 1990s. He managed to unify the federal state over the different Russian regions, of which there are 80. That was not an easy task. And he managed to harmonize the laws and bring the federal government back in control of the region. But the one thing he hadn't really managed to do was fix what he perceived as mistakes of Gorbachev and Yeltsin in allowing the West to move closer and closer to Russia's borders. Okay, so this is what we speculate is in Putin's head, but what has happened in Ukraine? How has he taken these ideas and put them in practice, if you will? So this is a map. I promised I would show it. I know Norman is going to refer to it later when he talks about Ukraine. This is as of yesterday where the Russians had moved into Ukraine. You'll remember that from December, the beginning of December, the Biden administration warned that Russia was massing troops along 3 borders of Ukraine, in the south and the Black Sea, using Crimea as a base, but also building up additional troops to the east in Russia, and then also to the north in Belarus. And we saw these troops building and building. They were using some materiel that was left over after a military exercise in April, but there was a great deal of mystery over whether this was going to lead to an invasion. And I say there was mystery because the American administration kept saying that there was an awful lot of equipment being amassed there, and it looked like an invasion was likely, particularly when the Russians moved hospitals, mobile hospitals, and plasma supplies. It really looked like that's the kind of thing you don't do for an exercise, you do when you're going to invade. But meanwhile, to some extent, the Ukrainians and also the Russians just couldn't believe, and to some extent the Europeans too, they couldn't believe that there was going to actually be an invasion in Ukraine, that there was no reason for Russia to invade Ukraine. And it's very difficult to imagine that even with 200,000 troops, that you would be able to control a country of 44 million people. And what we've seen so far is, in fact, the Russians have found it very tough sledding. They've met an incredible amount of resistance. And again, I'm going to let Norman go into that because that's the Ukraine is his department today. But what we're worried about is that the Russians are advancing much slower than they intended. They're having a lot of problems with logistics and supplying food, and also rearming their soldiers. And so it looks like what might happen is that they will try and encircle cities like Kiev, like they've done with Mariupol in the south, and basically flatten them to get the population to submit. And what we're all particularly worried about is having what happened in Ukraine replicate what the Russians did in Chechnya in 1995. This is the capital of Chechnya. It's now been completely rebuilt, but it was basically flattened until it succumbed to Russian federal rule. In the meantime, of course, people have been fleeing. This is the latest data as of today. 2 million people have left Ukraine, mostly women and children, and mostly in Poland. But there's no doubt that this is going to create an incredible humanitarian burden, particularly on Poland, and that these refugees are going to need a lot of support. Also, it's primarily women and children because men aren't being allowed to leave. They're staying to fight either by choice or because they're not allowed to leave. But the scale of this tragedy is hard to imagine. It's the biggest movement of refugees since World War II, and it is only getting started. I mean, we are seeing 500,000 people a day come through, and I expect this number to get much, much bigger. So what has the West done in the face of this horror? There have been quite a few economic measures. They're extremely extensive and much more far-reaching than we've ever tried before. And by we, I mean the US and Europe. So Russia is the 11th largest economy in the world. And while some of these measures had been tried on Iran or Venezuela, this is actually a big experiment. Nobody knows what's going to happen when you impose these kinds of sanctions and this kind of freezing out of an economy that is so large and so integrated into a lot of aspects of the world economy. So the main sanctions can come into a couple categories. The first is a freeze of banking assets. So we've all heard about kind of this throwing Russia out of SWIFT. I heard someone call it the de-SWIFTification of the Russian economy. But it turned out that that was not the nuclear option that we thought it was, because the real painful sanctions are the fact that the central bank's asset has been frozen. So Russia had accumulated about $640 billion in hard currency reserves, but they're not just sitting in dollars and euros in the basement of the Kremlin, and they can not run down and get them when they need them. In fact, some of them are in gold, some of them are in Chinese currency, but about half of those central bank assets are in foreign currency, yen or dollars or euros in banks abroad. And that money has now been frozen. So the Russians do not have access to it. They also, the largest banks, the 6 largest banks have been cut out of using correspondent bank accounts, which means they don't have any access to dollar transactions. And this is particularly important because in the global economy, even transactions, let's say between euros and yen, often pass through dollars on their way to making the transaction, because the Japanese bank or the Japanese company and the, let's say, German company will both have correspondent bank accounts in New York, and that's where the money will actually change hands. So essentially, Russia has been cut out of the global financial system. The second very important aspect of sanctions is export controls. These haven't gotten a lot of publicity. They're a little bit technical, but basically, Russia is not going to be able to get access to any US-made chips, avionics, integrated circuits, all of these pieces that are actually in almost everything we use now. So for example, Russia, it manufactures cars, but what that means is it assembles cars, and it assembles cars with parts that are made elsewhere. And those parts are no longer able to be sold into Russia. The other thing that we're seeing, for example, is that the airplane spare parts are what Russia would need in order to keep planes flying domestically. They are not going to have those spare parts. They've also been cut out of international insurance markets, and they're mostly flying leased planes. So they're not going to be able to fly those planes. And that also relates to the third direction, which is closing airspace to Russian planes. So there are a couple of different elements to this. One is that there are a lot of countries that have now said that no Russian planes can fly in its airspace. It's all of Europe, the UK, and the United States. So for example, when Russians need to fly, they were evacuating diplomats from Washington, and they basically have to fly north and then over the Baltic Sea and then get out to the Atlantic Ocean. They can't fly over any European countries. Even more serious, as far as the Russian economy is concerned, large shipping companies are no longer going to be delivering containers to Russia or picking up containers from Russia. So there is going to be no international trade happening, physical trade happening in or out of Russia. And then the fourth step is the sanctioning of the elites. You know, everybody's kind of getting excited about the yachts that are being confiscated. That's more an indication, I think, that the oligarchs did not see this coming, or they would have put those yachts in places where they couldn't have been confiscated. There are a lot of personal sanctions on the oligarchs. Many of them are trying to leave. I heard that they were at the Ritz-Carlton in Dubai yesterday. A friend of mine was drinking with them, and they were talking about all the assets they had put into Bitcoin. But that seems to have been largely unexpected, and certainly the scale of these sanctions on the overall economy and on individuals was unexpected. And yet, a lot of us are asking why we can't do more. Right? Zelensky has been calling for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and people don't necessarily understand why we want to do that. And I would say there are 4 reasons. These are the 3 ones that are perhaps most salient, right, or important. So one is there's no vital security interest, right? I mean, it's important that Ukraine is a democracy, that we feel that we want to protect it, that we're aghast at the horror that's being levied on the country. But Russia cares a lot more about the neighborhood that Ukraine is in than we do. And one of the lessons from Iraq and from Afghanistan for the American political establishment is that we really should not be fighting wars that are far away from our borders, where we don't have a vital security interest, narrowly defined. Secondly, we don't have any treaty responsibilities. So Ukraine is not a member of NATO. If it was a member of NATO and it had been attacked, that would trigger Article 5, which says that an attack against one NATO country is an attack against all of them. This is one of the reasons that Ukraine understandably wanted to join NATO. But the fact is, because they are not part of NATO, they were attacked by Russia, but there's no automatic response from NATO that's required. And then the third point is that there's not that much popular support in the US for going and putting boots on the ground in Ukraine, which is what Biden keeps saying. But I would urge us also not to lose sight of the fourth reason, right, which is Putin keeps reminding us that Russia is a nuclear power. And he has, at least rhetorically, put his troops or put his nuclear weapons on a slightly higher alert. The US did not respond to that, did not go to DEFCON 3. But one of the concerns that we have is that there is a nuclear risk involved in what's happening. So it's not only the risk of World War III if NATO gets involved in Ukraine. So for example, let's say NATO sets up a no-fly zone. That means that they shoot down a Russian plane that's flying in the no-fly zone, and then we actually are in World War III. The nuclear risk comes in two areas. One is, as we saw over the weekend, there was an attack on a nuclear power plant. That could be extremely serious, even if unintended. And I would point out that the risk to the nuclear plant is not that you hit the reactor, right? It's that you cut off the electricity to the plant, and then it is no longer able to cool the reactor or the spent fuel rods. And that's when you end up with a meltdown situation. So that's one nuclear risk. And the second is that Russia has a large number, thousands of tactical nuclear weapons. So when we think of nuclear weapons, we tend to think of strategic nuclear weapons, you know, those big ones coming out of the silo in Nebraska or something. Those are meant to fly between the US and Russia. But Russia also has, as I said, you know, maybe 1,200 to 5,000, we're not sure, tactical nuclear weapons, which are much smaller and which are meant not to wipe out cities, but to be used on the battlefield to press for a military advantage. We don't know if Russia would use them. We do know that what we're looking at right now is a conflict of asymmetric escalation, where we're essentially choking off the Russian economy, and then Putin is saying that's actually an act of war and raising his threat level. So we're in an extremely dangerous situation now where we don't exactly know what is going to trigger escalation and what could possibly lead us to this terrible situation. So I'm going to stop now and turn it over to Norman.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. And Norman, please.
Okay. Yes, thank you, Alexandra. That was very, very nicely done. I have a few things to talk to you about, but that was very useful. And yeah, thanks for that clear presentation. Thanks too for the invitation, Nina, to speak to this group. And I just want to make clear that my year at Wellesley was wonderful, not because of fleeing BU, but because of how wonderful Wellesley was too. That was really a lovely time in my teaching life. So, you know, my job today is to talk mostly about Ukraine, and, you know, I'll also talk about Russia as well. I mean, mostly I have to say, I just want to scream in frustration that there seems to be so little that we can do, you know, as a collectivity or as individuals to help. I mean, it's horrible watching people get pounded like that. And knowing people who are getting pounded the way they're getting pounded, and knowing also the country and loving the country, in fact, that's doing the pounding. So it's, you know, it's an extremely frustrating period for people in the field. But we are, after all, academics, and we have to try as best we can to try to understand what's going on. So I want to do this in sort of three parts. The first part is to talk a little bit about the Ukrainian point of view of the conflict that's going on. I'm sure you know it and you have heard it. The second part, I want to say a couple words about Putin's view of history, because in this particular case, history is extremely important. I mean, it's not, you know, it's not just, Ukraine is not just another country to Russia. These are entangled histories. And I want to talk about a little bit how he thinks about that, and then how the Ukrainians respond. And finally, you know, Nina's asked me, and I'm glad to do it, to talk a little bit about atrocity crimes that are going on in Ukraine, among them genocide. So we'll talk about that as well at the end. Okay, so it's pretty clear that Ukrainians see themselves under siege. They are under siege, and in the struggle for their very existence. I mean, I was mentioning to Nina earlier, I got an email from a Ukrainian colleague this morning saying we're here in Kiev fighting, and we will fight to the end. I mean, so this is an existential struggle for Ukrainians. They're in danger of losing their lives of course. And we don't know exactly how many people have been killed so far. I mean, 1,000, 1,500. There are no reliable counts, but they're in danger of losing their sovereignty, secondly, as a country, meaning their statehood. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, they're in danger of losing their nationality. They're in danger of losing their nation, which they have been building for 1,000 years. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later when we talk about Putin's view of history. It's just important to underline how dangerous this situation is, and we do not know what Putin's endgame is, and we're pretty clear about the fact, that he's, not the Putin of 10 years ago. I mean, I'd be glad to hear what Alexandra has to say about this. I do not think he's a rational actor. I think the invasion, was a serious mistake, and those speeches that he gave prior to the invasion strike me as somewhat, not completely, but somewhat deranged. It's also worth reiterating that the Ukrainians are fighting with unexpected tenacity and holding off a Russian invading army that is at least 10 times as powerful. It depends on how you measure it. But the Ukrainians are fighting very skillfully, and they're fighting very well. People, I'm sure Putin expected that the big cities would fall quickly: Kiev, Kharkiv, Mariupol, and other targets, immediate targets, and they haven't fallen, not yet. But the Ukrainians are fighting well. They're also maintaining unity in a time of extraordinarily difficult challenges. And this unity, again, is not necessarily a given. I mean, Alexandra mentioned that, Ukraine has gone through difficult times, political strife, internal difficulties, struggles among political parties, ups and downs of, governments and political coalitions. And they have come together. And Zelensky has been quite remarkable as a wartime leader. And I'm not sure anybody really expected that. He comes from a background as a comedian, a Jewish comedian, who's got a wonderful sense of humor. And he's using that sense of humor too. I love that line where he said, when we said, we'll get him out of the country, he says, I don't need a ride, I need arms. Right. And so, he's proven to be a quite extraordinary leader. The business yesterday of going back to his office, and saying, here I am, and I'm not going anywhere, was a wonderful move and bolsters clearly the morale of the Ukrainians, which is extraordinarily high. Again, one could have imagined, discussing this before the war, that it wouldn't have held in this way. Now, since 1991, when the Ukrainian state declared its independence, along with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukrainians have been searching for their place in the post-Soviet world. And as I mentioned, as Alexandra mentioned, it's not been easy. The goal has been democracy and rule of law, but there have been, kind of pro-Russian and pro-Western ways of thinking about organizing themselves politically. And culturally, Ukrainians have been split for a very long time, hundreds of years actually, between kind of pro-Russian and pro-Western factions, intellectuals who say, we're part of the West, and intellectuals who say we're part, of the Russian world. And by the way, those intellectuals didn't look for autonomy within the Russian world. They didn't look for complete absorption into it. And 2004, marked a very important moment in all of this, which is the Orange Revolution. And what happened in the Orange Revolution, in short, is Ukrainians made a decision that they want free elections, that they want democracy, that actually they want to be part of the West. And that was the first of the color revolutions, and introduced a whole series of color revolutions, which tended to threaten, the Russian growing autocracy. So you have this situation where Ukraine was moving more and more in the direction of democracy, of rule of law, of a real constitutional government, of trying desperately to get rid of corruption, which was a hard part for the Ukrainians, as it's hard for the Russians as well. And Russia moving in an opposite direction, increasing autocracy, increasing limitation of its citizens' freedoms, and increasingly fake elections. So you have these two countries moving in different directions. And Ukrainians were happy to move in their direction and let the Russians move in theirs. The Russians weren't happy to have the Ukrainians move in the direction of democracy, because democracy in Ukraine threatens Putin and threatens his autocracy. And that's how he sees it. During the Revolution of Dignity in Maidan Square in 2013 and 14, Ukrainians stood up again, much as they did during the Orange Revolution, and fought, this time physically fought. I mean, there were 137 people killed in Maidan. They call it the Golden 100, but it was more than 100 people who died, fighting against Yanukovych and his police, who were shooting at the demonstrators in Maidan. And they call it the Revolution of Dignity, for the right reasons. I mean, they wanted to stand up and have their own ability, to determine their own future. And that future, by the way, was to be the European Union, to join Europe. I mean, they had come to the conclusion, most Ukrainians and the Ukrainian leadership had come to the conclusion that one way to ensure democracy and the rule of law in Ukraine was to join up with the West, join up with Europe. They'll help us. We need a little bit of help. We're not an old state. We're not an old democracy. We need help. And so they wanted that help. And Yanukovych basically, turned his back on that. And the result was these demonstrations and, Yanukovych basically fleeing town. I mean, he had to. They were going to come after him. And that was a very important moment, where Ukrainians, again, are standing up for joining European Union. And I would say here, again, in response a little bit to Alexandra, not about NATO. This wasn't about NATO. Nobody gave a hoot about NATO at that moment. This was about joining an organization that's really about economics, about politics, about cultural exchange, and about open borders, about migration, free migration and that sort of thing. It wasn't about getting weapons. It wasn't about, turning on Russia militarily and threatening Russia militarily. It was about, the rule of law, really, and finding ways to institute that. In the negotiations following the Maidan, and this is important too, it became apparent that the Ukrainians, Nina, you can always go like this with me if I'm talking too long. Once I get going, it's hard to stop. So, just do that. In the negotiations after the Maidan about what was going to happen, the Russians annexed Crimea. And starting to threaten, Donetsk and Luhansk. And, the Ukrainians made two things clear in their, negotiations, the Minsk I, and more importantly, Minsk II. And first of all, they rejected what might be called a kind of Finlandization. And that means, they would give up their foreign policy prerogatives and, in exchange for domestic sovereignty in their politics. In other words, they made it clear that they wanted sovereignty. And sovereignty means, the ability to make your own foreign policy. And the second thing they did was to insist on their territorial integrity. I mean, that's somewhat separate. But if, I studied Finland after the war, and the Finns had to give up a lot of territory, and they had to give up their ability to make a foreign policy in order to maintain their domestic sovereignty. The Ukrainians are unwilling and were unwilling to do that. And in some ways that made Minsk and the way Minsk was going impossible, because the Russians were demanding, limitations on their sovereignty. Okay, the second area I wanted to talk about was Putin's historical conceptions. So it's first articulated in a 5,000 word plus screed in July of the last year, and then in almost all of the speeches he gave leading up to the invasion. And still, it's mentioned, the way he thinks historically is mentioned by government officials. And what he thinks fundamentally is that Ukrainians are not a separate nationality, that Ukrainians are just Russians warmed over. When he explains it, he says, okay, there's triune nations, right? There's the little Russians, meaning the Ukrainians, there's the Belarusians, and then there are the great Russians, and they're all Russians. We're all Russians. Forget the distinctions, right, between them. When he did, and he says then, Ukraine now is anti-Russia. That's what he calls it, anti-Russia, led by a bunch of neo-Nazis and right-wing fascists. Now, again, this is a little bit of madness, right, on the part of Putin. People think, by the way, he writes some of this stuff himself and did his own historical research. I can't quite believe that, but it doesn't matter. He's saying it, right? Whoever did this history. And a person like Zelensky, who after all is Jewish, whose parents fought in the Great Patriotic War against the Nazis. I mean, this is a kind of craziness on Putin's part, and deception on Putin's part. The other thing to say, Ukrainians respond, to this denial of nationality with considerable anger. I mean, if somebody says you don't deserve to exist, as a nation, a separate nation, they respond in kind. And both of these countries, again, have intertwined, entangled relations. I mean, it's really, really complicated and interesting on an abstract level. But the fact of the matter is, Ukrainians have their own distinct history. I mean, as Alexandra, implied in going back to Volodymyr. And, they've had an independent principality. They had the Cossack, entity in the 17th century that was essentially Ukraine. They were forced under the Russian Empire, to give up, their national distinctiveness, but they continued in a national movement so that it emerged in 1917, to have a couple of iterations of an independent Ukraine during World War II. There were ideas of resetting up an independent Ukraine. So independent Ukraine is not something that was made up. I mean, Putin claims the Soviet Union created independent Ukraine. So he's mad at the Soviets. He's mad at Lenin and the Bolsheviks, because what Lenin and the Bolsheviks did, says Putin, is to create this entity called Ukraine, to create a republic called Ukraine. Before there wasn't one, he said, which is, balderdash, but that's a different question. And in this program of what was called indigenization, where nations were allowed to develop their languages, their culture, their historiography, and so on, Ukrainians, did develop a sense of Ukrainian identity. Of course, Stalin in 1933, 1934, 1932, 33, in the Holodomor, the famine, the terror famine, tried to break the back of the Ukrainian nationality, and almost did. So Stalin reversed this process, but Putin blames this all on the Soviet Union. He blames them for giving Donetsk, to Ukraine in 1918 and 1919, and he blames Khrushchev, of course, for giving Crimea, to Ukraine in 1952. So I'm sorry, in 1954. So the point is that he's putting all his ideas into this almost anti-Soviet view of things. Let me just say one more thing of Putin's abuse of history, and that is about World War II. When the Ukrainians fought together with the Russians mostly, in the anti-Nazi, anti-German campaign. It's just crazy, to call them Nazis. It's insulting and hard on people, to absorb this view of history that he's proffering. Okay, finally, let me turn to this question of atrocity crimes. Atrocity crimes are a group of crimes, that are committed, and by the way, are now under the International Criminal Court, which came into existence in 2002, and under their basic aegis. Let's take genocide first. Putin claims that the Ukrainians are committing genocide in Donetsk and Luhansk. And I'm not going to justify that claim with any kind of, academic basis. There is none. It's just, it's sheer, I won't say lunacy, but it's a sheer distortion of what's going on. Both sides have been fighting against each other. Both sides have been blowing up each other's homes in Luhansk and Donetsk. Both sides have been sitting there in trenches, already for 8 years. So, it's one of those things where I'm not sure, why he does things like this. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have taken the Russians to the International Court of Justice. They've sued essentially Russia for genocide in Ukraine. And that suit is now being considered by the International Court of Justice, which is something different from the ICC, the International Criminal Court. International Court of Justice is a place, by the way, the Bosnians sued the Serbs also for genocide and partly won that suit earlier in this century. According to the December 1948 UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, genocide means, and I quote, to destroy all or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, as such, end of quote. And what this means is really to destroy or eliminate a nationality. And is that what Putin is trying to do in Ukraine? Certainly he disparages the Ukrainian nationality. Certainly the Russians are pounding the Ukrainians, killing civilians, for no good reason. And certainly his historical statements make you think that the possibility of genocide is there. But my view is, at least not yet, there is not genocide, but I'm sure the International Court of Justice is collecting evidence. In other words, it would have to be the kind of destruction that we saw, in Bosnia or in Rwanda or in other places where genocide has taken place. Putin's taken great offense at the Ukrainians' claim, a right one in my view, that the Holodomor was genocide, this terror famine of 1932-33. For Ukrainians, and this is important to understand, these attacks that are going on now are just another, episode in a long Russian history of trying to destroy Ukrainians and deprive them of their identity, which is extremely important. I mean, Ukrainians make this claim, of genocide and are increasingly making the claim. Now, there are two other crimes that do need to be considered, and I'll get there soon. One is a crime against humanity, and the other crimes against humanity, and the other are war crimes. And these two sets of crimes, also under the ICC, the prosecutor of the ICC is collecting evidence on both and has talked about war crimes in particular. And it surely looks like the Russians are committing war crimes in Ukraine. War crime is pounding civilian populations for no reason, just for pounding them, just for intimidating them. And that kind of direct intentional attack on civilian populations is a war crime. And Putin will be responsible and the leadership for that particular war crime. Also, such things as using the kind of weapons that people are worried about, cluster bombs, thermobaric weapons, are considered a war crime. So some of the weapons that the Russians may be using or will perhaps use, because we know they're there, would be considered a war crime. And finally, and most clearly, to me anyway, Putin is committing the fourth genre of crimes, again, genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. The final category of crimes is the war of aggression. And the war of aggression, this is clearly an example of, right? I mean, you may know that in Nuremberg in 1946, the Nazis weren't tried for genocide. I mean, there wasn't even a genocide convention. There wasn't international law against genocide. I mean, they were tried as a war of aggression for attacking Poland, attacking Yugoslavia, attacking the Soviet Union without provocation. Without provocation. There was no defensive war involved, right? So this is without provocation. The Russians are attacking the Ukrainians. And this is clearly a war of aggression, one which Putin, maybe one fine day, we'll see him stand trial for at the equivalent of Nuremberg. Okay, I mean, in the end, then, Putin and the Russian leadership is culpable and could be culpable. I mean, in the case of genocide, we don't know yet, really, for all of these crimes. Unfortunately, sadly for the Europeans, the evidence is adding up. Thank you.
Thank you to both of the speakers for your wonderful presentations. Of course, I feel like shooting myself. But that's the situation that we're in now. And I thought we'd have a little conversation, sort of after you've been going back and forth. Maybe I could just ask both of you, and then you can respond to each other what you think. Can you think of a scenario in which this war might have been prevented?
You want to start, Alexander?
Sure. I have heard rumors that when Russia presented its draft treaties to NATO and to the US about what they wanted in Ukraine, that they were actually interested in negotiating. Now, what they were asking for was unacceptable, right? They were basically asking that Ukraine never be allowed to join NATO, which is not a decision that the US would take for another country, or that NATO was willing to foreclose. But there are some indications that the Russians might have been satisfied with an assurance, a written assurance that Ukraine would not join NATO for 10 years or 20 years or some period of time. Now, I'm not saying that that's what we should have done, but I think that a compromise was actually possible in the Russians' conception of the evolution of this conflict. But once Putin had amassed the troops there and had his draft treaties basically thrown back in his face, he then had a point where he had to decide if he was going to pretend it was another military exercise and stand down or move forward. And it looks like at that point he decided that the only way was forward and he couldn't go back. So I think there was a chance. I'm not saying that it was something that a chance that should have been taken. Of course, we might reevaluate that when we see exactly how terrible things are going to become. But I don't think that the Russians were determined to invade no matter what.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, I agree sort of with what Alexandra is saying, in the sense that if Ukraine, and this is about Ukraine, I don't think this is about NATO. I think this is about Ukraine and about what Ukraine wanted to become. NATO's part of the story. It's certainly the context. Historians don't believe in one cause for things, right? I mean, this is a monocausal invasion. But this is about Ukraine and its direction. And Ukraine, as I mentioned, by the time of Maidan, had become determined to live its own life, right? To be a sovereign country. And were unwilling at that point, to make the kinds of concessions that would have limited their sovereignty. And so from Ukraine's point of view, I think, there was no escape hatch. There was no way out. They are insisting that they're a sovereign nation, right? And they're also insisting on their territorial integrity. I mean, deals about recognizing annexation of Crimea, deals about Donetsk and Luhansk. I mean, they reject it out of hand, and you can understand why, right? It's their territory. So I'm not sure, that a document about NATO, would have been possible in this kind of situation. The other thing I mentioned, I already did mention, and I'm not sure about this, and I have no way of really knowing, but I do think Putin has become a different kind of leader, and I mentioned this earlier, now than he was 10 years ago, and 15 years ago, and 20 years ago, or even in, or taking the 90s. I think he's evolved, and not in a good way. Right. And I mean, not only is he increasingly autocratic and isolated and irritable and all those kinds of things, but as I said, I think, I don't think he's crazy, but I think a part of him has become a little unhinged. And that part of him that's become a little unhinged is very dangerous. And the result is it's dangerous, not just Ukraine. We haven't talked about this yet, but it's also dangerous. I can understand why the Estonians and Latvians, Lithuanians are extremely nervous, and the Poles don't want to give up their airplanes, their MiGs, right? I mean, people are getting really nervous. And I must say, I'm getting nervous about his ultimate goals. I mean, initially, maybe Ukraine, but it could be more than that. We don't really know. So I'm not so sure that that this could have been avoided by some concession from the West about NATO.
Well, but do you think that we should see Ukraine as a totally innocent victim, as the country's been portrayed all over the media throughout this whole process? Or has Ukraine in some way helped to provoke Russia into at least some sort of aggression? Is to be held accountable at all?
So this. Do you want me to, Alexandra? You want to go first? No. Okay. So there are a couple of things to say. I mean, first of all, this goes to Alexandra's earlier point that I was going to challenge a bit, which is this question of vulnerability, right? Russia's feeling of vulnerability to attack and to invasion. This has been historically there. You're absolutely right. People have invaded them, but remember, they've also invaded people to the west and to the east and to the south. And not only that, the Russian Empire was built on invasion, right? Because somebody on the other side of the border threatened them. I mean, I worked on this, I worked on Holodomor at one point, quite intensely. And you see that Stalin is worried in 1932 about the Poles attacking. Well, the Poles, he uses that as a justification for going after the Ukrainians. Were the Poles really going to attack him in 1932? It's almost out of the question. Right, so you get these things on the part of Putin. NATO's the furthest thing from their mind is to attack Russia. The furthest thing from their mind is to attack Russia. The furthest thing from our mind now is to get involved here and fight with Russia. That's right. I mean, he's blaming us, for this crisis, but in fact, we don't want to fight the Russians at all. I mean, it's zero. there may be a few people in Congress who said, let's go to war. So my view of this is, yes, the Ukrainians are an innocent party. They have been attacked. They didn't think they'd be attacked. By the way, I didn't think they would be attacked. Most Russians didn't think they'd be attacked. I mean, this comes from Putin and his clique, which believes, and he believes, or believed, maybe now it's in the past tense since, Ukraine hasn't fallen, that controlling Ukraine in one fashion or another, it doesn't have to be eliminating the state, it doesn't have to be eliminating the nation, both of which they're in danger of, right? But controlling Ukraine is in the interests of his power, which you pointed out, Alexander. I mean, it's in his interest of how he thinks about his Eurasian empire, right? And I think that's why they attacked. And I think in this case, yes, I mean, the Ukrainians, say things about the Russians. They write things about the Russians, some true, some not true. They attack the Russians for this and that. Rhetorically, the Russians attack them rhetorically. That doesn't mean that you invade a country, right? With 180,000 troops, or however, God knows how many, they're ready to put into Ukraine or bombard cities and kill civilians. So yes, I think Ukraine is the innocent party.
That's a very clear answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alexandra, any comments before we move on?
Yeah, so I mean, I tend to agree with Norman, but I'm thinking like how to explain why that's the case, right? And I would look at what happened in Crimea, right? In 2014, the Russians annexed part of Ukrainian territory, and the Ukrainians were very upset, but they didn't go to war to get it back, right? Because they didn't want to fight Russia.
Right.
And then Russia tries to foment these kind of separatist movements in the cities along the south and along the east coast, and most of them fizzle except in Donetsk and Luhansk, right? And these Russian-backed separatists, everyone knows they're Russian-backed, Russian military supplies, probably commanders also. They're holding part of eastern Ukraine for 8 years. And of course, there are skirmishes on the line of contact, but the aggressor there was already Russia, right? And so what we've seen now is kind of continued aggression. It's not like they were having a standoff and they were throwing insults back and forth. And then, a little bit more what happened in Georgia, actually, where the Georgians fell for the Russian provocation and then, sort of opened themselves up to the response. I think the Ukrainians have been very careful here not to inflame the Russians, not to have what was happening in Donetsk and Luhansk expand and explode beyond there. But the Russians were determined to do that. And by the Russians, I mean, the Kremlin.
Right.
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, the Ukrainians, and even now, they can't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for what? I mean, there's some lady, there was an old lady walking down, on one of these bridges coming over the bridge in Kiev, and she's, holding her head and saying, "Za что? What for? What is this for? Why is this happening?" And I think the Ukrainians certainly didn't want it. So, I mean, they are, Nina, the innocent party. I mean, again, it doesn't mean.
Well, it's good to be clear. Yeah. Right. There are so many questions and like 28 questions in the Q&A, so that I think, if you don't mind, we'll kind of go to those and then you can bat those around.
Sure.
And there's several questions that have to do with what are the thoughts on will Putin stop at Ukraine? I think another question sort of around that has Putin gone too far that he actually can't pull out now? I mean, is it really sort of clear that he will accept nothing but total regime change? So, what are possible scenarios for how this whole thing will possibly end for Ukraine, for the global balance of power? That's a question that had been posed. Any thoughts about that? Yeah, Sandra.
Putin told Macron that like this ends either through negotiation or war, but when we control Ukraine, right? I mean, now we don't know if he stops at Ukraine. I see there are a lot of questions in the chat about that. That's a separate question, but I don't see a scenario where Putin goes, you know what, like I'm not going to win this thing, and he tries to turn his tanks around and bring them back over the border. Like, first of all, that doesn't seem to be possible because the way they've broken down, but just in general, like that, Putin is not the kind of guy who would lose face like that and just give up and turn around. Like something catastrophic would have to happen for that to seem like the best thing he could do. And I think he would rather destroy Ukraine than do that. Now, in terms of whether he would go further, I mean, the question that most of us are asking is about Moldova, right, which is not a NATO country. It's small. It's just on the border with Ukraine. And it also has a Russian separatist population along a 250-mile strip. My guess is that the Russians already realize that they've bitten off way more than they can chew, and they're going to be bogged down in Ukraine for quite a while. I don't want to say I can't imagine, because a lot of unimaginable things have happened, but I think that they are stuck in Ukraine for a while at this point.
Well, yes. I mean, if they impose a regime change, they would have to have an extensive and long and widespread military occupation in order to make this thing work.
Yeah, and where are those people coming from, right? They don't have enough soldiers. They don't have enough policemen. Like, they don't have the number of people that you would need to occupy a city like Kiev, just say nothing about the country.
So it took Nina, I think they had 280,000 Soviet troops in Eastern Germany, a country of 17 million, to occupy it, and when there was this German Democratic Republic.
Right.
So they certainly don't have the troops to occupy. I mean, the other thing to say is that the Ukrainians have sworn to fight. Now, again, we don't know exactly what that means, but a kind of guerrilla war. And it's worth reminding ourselves that, especially in Western Ukraine, that fight went on, after the Soviets retook Western Ukraine, which they had occupied initially along, when they split Poland with the Nazis in 1939-40. That reoccupation of Western Ukraine led to years, into the 50s, of fighting on the part of Ukrainians against the Soviets. And they killed a lot of Soviets. I mean, it was bitter, brutal bloodshed that went on in Ukraine for a very long time. The other thing I noticed and noted in some of the speeches of some of Zelensky's cabinet members who spoke to the press is they mentioned their Cossack traditions. Those Cossack traditions, I mean, they go back a long time, and it's not, we know about traditions and how they're used and abused and called forth for a lot of different reasons. But Ukrainians, have this strong, freedom-loving, fighting spirit, right? That's embedded in their history, and they can draw on it, and presumably will draw on it, if actually these cities fall and there is regime change, as you mentioned. So the fighting could go on a long time, right. And especially since we have more or less committed ourselves to supplying arms. And to, Alexandra beautifully explained the sanctions. These sanctions are going to hurt Russia a lot. They're going to hurt Russians. They're not going to want this, ongoing fight. Maybe eventually something will happen internally. And that's the other thing we have to just keep in mind. I mean, I think it's unlikely, that there'll be some kind of coup, or that, demonstrations of hundreds of thousands of people will force Putin out. It seems, again, on the rational level, it's unlikely.
Yeah.
But we don't know. We don't know what's coming. And, Ukrainians seem able and willing to continue the fight, even if some of the cities fall.
Right. Well, we don't know what's coming. I think also part of it has to do with Putin's mental state. So to try to predict, today the US CIA director said the guy is not unhinged. He just is very determined to get what he wants, and he's become very difficult to deal with. Well, duh. Yeah. But it's possible that there's something really wrong here. And then, we're in the hands of, my Russian friends on the phone refer to him as crazy man, so, right. And so one of the questions here is there a way to truly gauge how much support Putin has among the Russian population?
So we don't know from opinion polls, right? Opinion polls have been carried out in Russia since the 90s, but under Putin, people have become more and more nervous about saying that they don't support the government or they don't support him. So we have to assume that whatever data we have underestimates the degree of skepticism or resistance to Putin. That being said, there is not very much information about what's going on in Ukraine getting into Russia. And there seems to be a lot of popular support for getting rid of Nazis in Ukraine, which is what people are being fed on the state media. Now, I spoke to someone who was involved in polling, and I said, how is that possible? At least until they cracked down on the media this week, they had all the same access to New York Times or Financial Times or The Economist, like all the same sources we do, right? There's no firewall like there is in China. And he said, well, let's say 1% of the population is reading that kind of Western media. Then you've got about 15% of the population, the intelligentsia, that was listening to Echo Moskvy or reading the New Times or following Meduza or Dozhd and the other independent media. Then you've got the older generation, which is watching Russian TV, right, which is just the state party line. You've got a large part of the population that's not particularly internet savvy. They have access to the internet, but when they're looking for news, they basically go to Yandex, which is the Russian Google, except Yandex is pulling up, again, the state party line and the state media. So they might think that they're searching for what's going on, but they're actually getting the same thing that people are getting on TV. And then there's the younger generation, which is, of course, internet savvy, but is just doing TikTok videos. Right now, maybe there's a little bit of information coming through those, but from what I can tell, most of the population does not believe that there's a war happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's right.
And so to think that there's going to be some kind of popular uprising, it's just, I don't see it happening right now. I don't see it happening because people are outraged at what's happening. I think if they knew what was happening in Ukraine, they would be outraged, but they don't know. And it's going to be when the economic sanctions really start to bite, and they will, then potentially people might be upset at Putin. But it's not going to be because they're seeing the terrible pictures we're seeing about, children and women and destruction. They're not seeing that.
Right. And when I spoke to one person who's sort of a Putin supporter, he said he doesn't want to know. I said, do you want me to tell you what's really going on? He said, no, I don't want to know. I mean, his main source, I said, what is your source of information? He doesn't have a television. He watches he reads the Ministry of Defense website. And then I looked at it and I was horrified, you can imagine. Well, I suppose some of these questions have to do with China. What's China's role in all this? How has it affected relations between Russia and China? Anybody want to take that one on?
Well, I hosted a panel on that this week, so I'm an expert on that too now.
Okay,
Go ahead.
Let's hear it.
I asked a lot of questions, but from what I understand, the Chinese are rather uncomfortable at the position they've been put in, right? They have declared, they signed an agreement with Putin right before the Olympics, which announced they were going to have a strategic partnership with no limits, right? And even though it looks like Putin probably told Xi Jinping that he was planning on doing something in Ukraine, and Xi Jinping told him to wait until after the Olympics, I don't think the Chinese anticipated that there was going to be this major invasion of Ukraine. The Chinese have always emphasized sovereignty of other countries. We might find that ironic, but that's the line. And so there is no way for them to be supportive of Russia and supportive of the principle of sovereignty that they say is so important. At the same time, I think there are a couple lessons that they're drawing. One is that they, like a lot of other people, didn't anticipate the speed and extent of the sanctions. And even though it would be very difficult to unplug sanction from China from the global economy, the way that we're basically unplugging Russia, I think it still gives them pause when they think about Taiwan. Right? It's like, what would be the economic consequences of taking over Taiwan? They see it as a different situation, right? Because it's not an independent country with its own sovereignty, right? In their reading of it. And then the other thing is that I think they're looking at the difficulty that the Russian army is having and wondering like, what does an amphibious landing look like when you're taking over, people that don't want to be taken over? So the Chinese really now are a bit on the back foot. They also have significant trade relations with Ukraine. and the Chinese Belt and Road was going to go through Ukraine. So there are a lot of questions. And I think the fact that they have been, if anything, pressing Putin to negotiate suggests that this is not at all the way they want the world order to evolve.
So
Right.
I would just add to that. I mean, I agree with everything Alexandra said. But the only thing to add, it really has to do with the Chinese offer to negotiate. I mean, and to be middleman in this conflict, and they've offered, to do that. And I think it's probably a worthwhile thing for the Ukrainians to take up, because the Chinese, in some ways, can be an honest broker. I mean, the Israelis tried, obviously, but Israel is in a different kind of position, I think, than China. But, China has, serious influence, I think, in both capitals, in Kiev and in Moscow, and, maybe can accomplish something no one else can. I mean, they weren't involved in the Minsk process. They're not the French, the Germans, who were, and or Poles. They're basically have backed Putin. And so it's possible some kind of negotiated settlement can come, but it's really tough given, again, the Ukrainian position, that they insist on their sovereignty and they're ready to fight for it.
Well, but I think, isn't it true that Zelensky was just in today's Moscow Times, there was an article where he said he could compromise, he'd be willing to discuss compromises on perhaps accepting Crimea as Russian, and maybe even Donetsk and Luhansk. I mean, it seems to me that those are the two places where Zelensky might actually make concessions, but not on Putin's other three demands of demilitarization, neutrality, meaning don't ever join NATO, and denazification, meaning regime change.
By the way, Nina, denazification means more than that. Denazification means taking the elite and those who have spoken in anti-Russian ways and arresting them all, and putting them on trial and deporting some, and Lord knows, killing some. Now, there's denazification. If you take denazification, the last time the Soviets denazified, again, was in Germany after the Second World War. Right. And what did they do? Intelligence people and military people and judicial people arrested, thousands and thousands of Germans, some Nazis, some not Nazis, who were simply anti-Soviet, and did them in various sorts of ways, put them in prison. There were special camps, sent them to labor camps in Siberia, and hanged a lot. So denazification doesn't just mean regime change. It means a serious attack on the Ukrainian elite, which has been, stood up to them and stood up to Putin. It's scary. I mean, denazification is very scary.
Right. And do you think they're, sorry, I'm just pointing to all the Q&A and saying, sorry, folks, just do you think that the game plan is actually to kill Zelensky, or just what else can they do with him?
I mean, he says so, and he has reason for saying so, killing himself and his family. And I think about a little bit like what they did to Imre Nagy, during the 1956 Hungarian uprising, which is to arrest him, move him. I mean, they lied and cheated in doing so, but they managed to arrest him, moved him out of the country, and eventually did him in. So, I mean, I think Zelensky's life is definitely in danger.
Right. Well,
and not just Zelensky. I mean, the Ukrainian elite. And again, if you look at it from a Ukrainian point of view, I mean, I've read a lot of Ukrainian stuff about this. And, Ukrainians, again, believe this is a part of the entire history, right, of Russian attempts, to kind of decapitate and destroy those people who want, a serious, independent Ukrainian identity and to be able to rule themselves as they see fit. So it's just another stage for them in a long genocidal history. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's how Ukrainians look at it, and they may not be wrong. which is the scary part of it.
That's their narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I agree that I really don't see how a popular uprising from the streets is going to oust Putin. It just doesn't seem likely. But there's some questions here about, about the Russian oligarchs. If the Russian oligarchs decide he's too much of a risk, could they engineer his ouster? What do people think, could happen there to get rid of Putin and have something else someone else in his place? I mean, Alexandra, maybe you want to.
Sure. So we had an interesting moment when Putin hauled in the top 30 oligarchs or oligarchs, the people who are basically making money because they've been put in state-owned corporations and are able to collect rents. And of course, they were masked, but you could kind of see the horror in their eyes about what Putin had gotten Russia into. We then saw three oligarchs, including two that were in London, come out against the war. And then we're waiting to see if someone else would come out against it. And nobody has. Some of them have left, gone to Dubai or wherever. But the ones that are in Russia, if they come out against Putin, they're basically finished. Like if they're lucky, they just will lose their wealth and their job. If they're unlucky, they'll be put in jail and they'll be making mittens for 10 years, like Khodorkovsky was, to set an example. So I think the one moment where there could have been a crack in the elite was immediately after the invasion started. And now I think the ones that are there are basically doubling down and trying quietly to figure out how they're going to survive this. I was speaking to someone who used to work on sanctions in Treasury. And I said, so what is the theory about sanctions, right? That we crush the economy and that the elite fractures and turns against Putin because he's no longer providing, the economic goodies to which they've been accustomed? Or is it that you put so much pressure on the economy that people go out on the street and they protest and they change the regime? Because neither of those seem particularly likely to me in the short or the medium term. And he said, no, actually, they're not even punishment, right? The whole point of the sanctions is to affect behavior. So you introduce them because you think that you're somehow going to get leverage over, Putin in this case. But the problem is that in order for that to work, you have to be able to dial them up and dial them down. And the US has always been very bad at that. So if we really thought that the sanctions were going to change Putin's behavior, we would have to be saying, if you pull your troops out of Ukraine, we will release the central bank assets, for example. Like they have to be structured as an incentive where they could be lifted. Whereas now the Russians assume they're basically there forever. And so they no longer have any impact except to create a huge, economic problem.
Well, but
I mean, sanctions, I should say sanctions in the international system are not just about, altering your opponent's behavior. They're also about punishment.
Well, they're actually never about altering behavior the way they're left.
Well, I mean, the idea is to incentivize a change in behavior. I mean, that's the idea of the sanctions is to change behavior. But they're also about punishment. And, punishment's important too. I mean, again, you can't, we don't know what's going on in Mr. Putin's mind. Now, some people will use a Hitler analogy. I'm not there yet. Right? I'm not there. I don't think Russia is Nazi Germany. I don't think Putin is Hitler. But it's worth thinking about, right? This kind of analogy that it's one step, then another step, then another step, then another step. So the sanctions are there as a way to show him, right, that this is unacceptable and that they can be dialed up again. Harder, as you say, to dial down than to dial up. So it's it's a punishment for violating the rules of the international system.
Well, I agree that I'm just the moderator, but anyway,
you can say whatever you want.
You still get an opinion.
No. I agree that Putin is not Hitler. I mean, at first, when he on February 21, when he recognized Donetsk and Luhansk, I thought about Nicholas I in 1854. Going into Moldavia and, Wallachia, and starting the Crimean War because he was sort of recognizing these principalities to protect the Orthodox Slavs. And then, Britain and France put a stop to that mighty quickly.
Absolutely. By the way, I mean, there's a lot about Nicholas I that is reminiscent of Putin. There are a lot about Putin that's reminiscent of
Nicholas I.
Orthodoxy, nationality, all that sort of stuff. And the way he thinks about Ukraine, which is the same way Nicholas did. As this kind of, simply another part of Russia. And who are they, to have, want to establish their own nationality, to write in Ukrainian. I mean, so Nicholas, and actually after him, Alexander II too, was not ready to accept Ukrainian nationality as a real nationality, as people, there was a law passed against using Ukrainian language and publishing books in Ukrainian. So, the Ukrainian national movement gathered itself in the middle of the 19th century in many ways. And, the Russians, Nicholas I, Alexander II, Uvarov, our friend who was Minister of Education,
right,
under Alexander, fought them. And made it extremely difficult, and then some Ukrainians just fled to the West to continue their national work and their national project.
Well, but he was cracking down on cracking down on the Poles too.
Yes.
Also, the Poles weren't supposed to speak Polish, or even.
That's right.
Right. So it wasn't just Ukraine.
No.
It was the idea, right?
Yeah, but that's one of the reasons the Poles also wanted to be independent of Russia, right? And one of the, it's and the Ukrainians, have the same instinct as the Poles had. We want to have our own country.
Well, if we could have if you can still keep going a little bit, there's a question here about the effect of the media, whether Russia could ever again be a home for independent media while Putin is still president. What is the long-term effect of having this media shut down? I mean, that's a huge transformation in the lives of Russians. And I see this was a question by one of my splendid students. So I hope you'll respond to it.
I don't see independent media coming back. I mean, once Putin has taken the step to crush Echo Moskwy and the other various publications, there's really no reason for him to bring it back, right? He doesn't particularly like having them. We had thought for a long time, maybe it's a pressure valve, right? The intelligentsia can, say the things that they want to say and nobody pays attention to it anyway. But I would see no reason for him to bring back opposition, in the same way that we've seen that the crackdown on the educational institutions has only increased and increased and increased. Like, you never move back from repression in this regime. The question is sort of what happens after Putin. And one of the things that concerns me is that when I look at the people that are around him that are likely successors, let's say if there's a succession and not a revolution of some kind, none of those guys strike me as friendlier or more appealing than Putin. I think we've moved beyond this being a Putin problem. I mean, I think he got us into this war. But I think at this point, it's unclear that if Putin is removed, that the person who replaces him presents us with better options.
Well, constitutionally, it would be the prime minister.
No, I mean, like if there's an election, and whoever the chosen successor is, kind of comes in when he's ready to step down, but like Sechin, Bortnikov,
or Shoigu, the defense minister.
Yeah, none of those guys are going to have, I think, significantly different policies, at least for the first term that they come into office.
So two little footnotes. One, again, I don't think we can necessarily exclude the possibility of him being removed. I mean, just going to say that. Mm-hmm. I mean, I woke up that morning when Khrushchev was removed, and nobody knew what was happening and how it happened, right? So you can hope. And the second thing is, I do hope. Meaning, I think I disagree slightly with what you're saying, Alexandra, in the sense that Putin now has gone beyond what we call the pale, right? I mean, he has now violated, I mean, the push in Crimea, the business in Donetsk and Luhansk, all of that was within some kind of understandable structure and context, which we didn't like, right? But, could be understood, and not just by us, but by Russians and Ukrainians, right? I mean, Ukrainians even, again, they understood what was going on one level. What's happening now, is such, I think, again, I mean, I'll just give you my opinion, has gone beyond, what is acceptable at all and understandable at all. It's way too far in the international system. And by saying that, again, I think he made a mistake. I mean, we can argue, how that mistake was made and to what extent it was a mistake. I think he made a mistake, and I think that mistake was made because, again, not so much. I mean, I don't want to use the word unhinged too much, because fundamentally, I think he's a rational actor. But I also think there's something going on there that's more irrational than just means and ends kinds of decisions. He's made a terrible error. He's destroying two countries, one Ukraine and the second Russia. Right. And Lord knows what might be coming afterwards. So I would chance the bet that whoever replaces him has got to be better. I mean, even the communists, as the only people in the Duma who have spoken up against the invasion are these old communists, right? And so, do I want the communists back? Well, not really, but I sure as hell would like them back more than I would want Putin right now. So,
right. Yes. Well, I can also ask, and this is based on some of the questions here, Alexandra, you were talking about Putin's goals to keep NATO far away. He was so successful, not at keeping NATO far away, obviously, but at working to weaken the European Union, working to weaken the Western alliance. He was helped by the American president a few years back, but he was very successful at that. And then he wants to, you said, to be a great power and respected. I mean, it'll be years before Russia could be a respected member of the global community. So then what do you make of a policy? This is where Norman, building up what Norman says, of doing things to absolutely run counter to what his goals are.
So this reminds me of discussions. I've met with Russians a lot, right, over the decades. And the one thing they really hate is being told what's in their national interest, right? Like, why are you doing this? It's not in your national interest, right? And they have their own way of understanding what's rational and what's irrational, in the sense of supporting national interest and not supporting national interest. And I don't think that Putin is unhinged. I do think he's obsessed, like to the point of being, not able to fully assess the risks of what he's doing. But I think that he and that inner circle had convinced themselves that they needed to control Ukraine in order for Russia to be secure, right? And we can say, like, it's crazy, NATO would never attack Russia, but you have to remember also in the Kremlin, like when there was the support for Trump before the 2016 election, I went to Moscow in December, right after the election. They're like, thank God Trump won, because Hillary Clinton, the first thing she was going to do is declare war on Russia.
Yeah, I heard the same thing.
And they really, sure. I guess they believed it, right? I mean, these were kind of the political class that was in high-level universities and in sort of these inner circles. And you think, like, there's no way Hillary Clinton was going to declare war on Russia, but that's what they thought. Like, Trump was a safer bet. So I'm not saying that we need to, somehow endorse these points of view, but I think that there is a way of understanding what Putin has done where they've convinced themselves that, like, this was actually what they had to do in order to be more secure. And the question for me now is, as Norman points out, like, it seems so crazy. Like, how can people believe what they're being asked to give up, right, in exchange for this illusory goal? But I just wonder, people get used to everything, right? They get used to so many things that seem unimaginable. And I wonder, in a month or in 6 months or so, if people are going to say, yeah, well, it was obvious that, the Americans wanted us weakened. They imposed all of these sanctions, like we're doing our best to survive, but we can't really because the West won't let us. I mean, there's a way that people convince themselves, and they have the state television propaganda to help them convince themselves that what's happening is happening for a reason, right? That the president is right, that he's defending Russia. And I also agree with Norman, by the way, that like we're always caught by surprise by revolutions. We never expect them. We never predict them. Like, even though we spend all our time sitting around talking about politics, like, in fact, we don't actually know why all of a sudden, like, people take to the streets and overthrow their government. And I think it could happen, but I don't see the forces mobilizing in that direction. I don't see where they come from.
Well,
sorry.
Yeah. I could see that Norman didn't quite agree when you were talking about it's being Russian security.
Again, this.
His facial
I don't believe it either, but I believe that they believe it.
No, some of them believe it, and the reason they believe it, again, is that information is controlled. I mean, the fundamental argument, that somehow the Russians think they're doing what's in their interests. The Russian people think that they're doing what's in their interests, is in some ways negated by the fact that they don't get information. And the reason they don't get information, because if they had it, they would say, this is not in our interest at all.
I totally agree.
I feel really badly for the Russians. I mean, I want to make sure that we say at some point here, or that I say, that, the Russians are suffering too, many of them. Under the burden of this war, those who know that what's really going on.
Oh, yeah.
And if the others knew what was really going on, I think a large proportion of them would also say, no, we don't want to attack our Ukrainian brothers. I mean,
I don't disagree.
And Ukrainians say the same thing. Yeah. Why are the Russians attacking us? We're their brothers. This business, Nina sent this incredible thing this morning, a video. Kharkiv, which is a, Russian, Russians have a deep history in Kharkiv, and it's now being destroyed in the name of Russians. So, my feeling is that even if you take, babushka or, your average Russian worker or somebody out in the boondocks, and you actually gave them the right the information was, let's say both sides presented their information. I think Russians would say, no, we don't want this. This is crazy.
I had a fantasy that the soldiers who were sent out would say, we're not going to shoot our brother Ukrainians, and we're not going to shoot these people. But that didn't happen.
Well, you don't know, Nina. We don't know exactly what's going on. I mean, I have a hunch that part of the poor performance, and generally it's been seen as a poor performance of the Russian army in Ukraine, is attributable to real hesitation on the part of many soldiers. Now, you don't know how many, you don't know how deep it is, but my gut feeling about this is, this was true in Czechoslovakia in 1968 too, that, Russian soldiers didn't even know what the hell they were doing when they got there. And when they finally figured out what they were doing, there were many of them embarrassed and we're deeply unhappy about what had happened and how they were being used, to crush, in quotes, the fascists, right, in Prague. So, we don't know a lot about what's going on. And again, remember, we're in a situation now really close to 2 weeks, and it's a stalemate. It's a stalemate of sorts. The Russians are moving. It's clear that, they're moving further than they were, but it's still a stalemate. And why is it a stalemate? Well, part of it is things aren't working on the Russian side the way they thought it would.
Yeah. I think we're going to be winding up soon, but a colleague writes, could we please talk, this is going to speak to Norman's heart, about the humanity of the Ukrainian people and the enormous trauma this has provoked in Ukraine and also the entire region. You're going to start crying.
It's horrible. I mean, thank you, colleague, whoever you may be. This is a terrible tragedy for Ukrainians. They really were getting on their feet. I mean, it's been a struggle. Again, there hasn't been an independent Ukrainian state of the sort, even let's take Poland, which took a while to get its act in gear, but they had an interwar Polish state. There wasn't any interwar Ukrainian state. There are a lot of political divisions. There's strong Western, regions, tied into the old Austro-Hungarian Empire and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Eastern regions, which were tied more into Russia, and then the Cossack traditions in the South and in Sloboda, Ukraine. So they had a lot to deal with, building a nation, and it was working. As Nina knows, I'm on a couple of Ukrainian historical museum projects, and you could see it work. You could see them figuring out, how they wanted to represent themselves, to themselves, most importantly, but also to the world. And this is really shattering. I mean, it's really shattering, and it's traumatic, deeply traumatic. I mean, war is always traumatic. And war, by the way, again, as a student of genocide, war breeds other things. And one of the things war breeds is genocide. We don't know yet in Ukraine, what's happening exactly, but war can breed, some of the worst, most awful things on a people that we can imagine. The war crimes that are going on, crimes against humanity. The prospects are grim. And what's already happened is grim. So I feel deeply for the Ukrainian people. I really do. I think this is a terrible tragedy. And as I said at the very beginning, there's a kind of helpless feeling we have too. We have this sort of sense that, Putin's on the march, the Russians are on the march, and there's really nothing we can do. Nothing serious except for, maybe providing arms and sanctions and this and that. But we can't fight a war. I mean, we haven't gotten into that question, but we can't fight a war with the Russians over Ukraine, and we won't. I mean, can I say one more thing, Nina? Am I talking too much?
You can say one more thing.
Okay, I just want to say, this is in response to one of Alexandra's points about security interests and vital security interests. He says there's no vital security interest of the United States in Ukraine. And I humbly disagree. And I disagree for the following reason. We don't know what's a vital security interest for the United States. In other words, when you assess security interests, they change. And they certainly change wildly in the course of the war. Think about the Second World War, where our security interests changed wildly, right? And all of a sudden we were in the middle of everything. World War I, very similar. In the beginning, who in America cared about what was going on over in Europe? But our security interests change, and what could well happen in this case, is a shifting of our security interests, and we see that already with NATO, moving to defend the Baltics, Poland, Romania, moving in troops, we're moving in weapons, we're moving in all kinds of stuff because we're worried, and I think correctly so, that this may not be the end of it. That Putin might threaten our allies in NATO. And the result is that means our security interests at their very core are threatened by what's going on in Ukraine.
I have to respond, right? I mean, I see your point, of course. I don't think that you're wrong about the fact that we may have to do something, but I think if we thought that Ukraine was a vital security interest, we would also have to call Moldova and Georgia vital security interests. And if we look at what happened in Georgia, there was a debate, right? And it was decided that it wasn't actually a vital security interest, that we could live with the Russians in Georgia. Now, I agree it's completely appalling, right? I'm certainly not saying that this kind of cold calculus is the way that people think, but one of the lessons from Iraq and Afghanistan is that we don't want to be fighting wars for 30 years, thousands of miles away from home, right? And at some point, you can say, like, it's our vital interest to preserve democracy, right? It's our vital interest to make sure that a country that really wants to be sovereign is sovereign. And I don't disagree with the fact that we want those things, but I don't know if that means, if that is a vital security interest, then you do put boots on the ground to protect it because it's vital. And we're not there yet.
No, we're not there yet. But remember, again, this is a country of 44 million people, which it's the second biggest country in Europe, right after Russia. It borders on 5 NATO nations. I just, it's not Georgia, and it's not Moldova. And for full respect to Georgia and Moldova. But this is a huge piece of European security we're dealing with, a huge piece of it. And, I think our interests are definitely involved. And when you say that, I mean, I buy your argument about vital interests, but again, they can evolve, and they do evolve in wartime situations.
I don't disagree.
And this one may well quickly evolve into something where we have to put our foot down.
Well, I mean, and again, like if we talk about tactical nuclear weapons, like we might decide, like, it is not okay for a country to ever use those weapons in the battlefield. And now it is in our interest to make sure that message is sent loud and clear. Like, I completely agree with you.
There we go.
Let's stop now, Nina, while we agree.
Well, no, I think suffering of both in Ukraine and Russia and in the region is the basso continuo over which this symphony will continue to be played out, to use a musical metaphor. I wish I could end up with something upbeat. I had a little paragraph here about how people should not give up on Russian culture. This is my grandfather's statue of Pushkin that he bought in 1899 on the centennial of Pushkin's birth. Centennial of Pushkin's birth. But I really can't end on any positive note. So we should just continue to follow the news. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to both of you for this extraordinarily clear and enlightening presentation. And on behalf of Wellesley College and our whole community, I want to just thank you enormously. I mean, we can't really hear any applause. I have a sound machine.
Nice. Thank you, Nina.
I can't hear anything.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I think we'll end this meeting now, and we'll be in touch, the three of us, by email anyway, and I'll tell you how wonderful you were.